Methods for learning Chinese can be good because they are efficient, because they focus on the right content, or because they are enjoyable, allowing you to spend more time. But no method is good in all these areas at once. So what should you do if you just don't like the most efficient method? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about good methods for learning Chinese, and as we shall see, there are many different ways in which a method can be good, so sometimes they are in conflict with each other. Maybe there's a super efficient method for learning, but when you try it out, you just don't like it. And if you don't like it, you will also study less, and that means that overall you might also learn less, even though the method itself is more efficient. There's also the opposite case, where you find a method for learning Chinese that isn't very good, but you like it a lot, so it enables you to spend more time studying. When discussing motivation and preferences, it is important to keep in mind that we are all different and we like different things. So even if I might say that something is boring or not interesting in this episode, I realize that there are people who find these things interesting and enjoyable, but I've based my perspective here on what I hear from students the most. But the general discussion is still the same, we just happen to like different things. So let's start talking a little bit about what a good method for learning Chinese is. And if you just ask a random person about this, they might say something like, oh, it's a method that helps you learn the language. Okay, that's fine, but it doesn't really add any information that wasn't already present in the question. So let's try again. A good method for learning Chinese is one that helps you reach your goals for learning Chinese. This definition is a little bit better because it takes your specific goals for learning Chinese into account, and as long as you know your goals, this is a much more helpful way of looking at it. This also enables us to say that some methods might be good for some students but not others, depending on what their goals are. However, I think we need to move beyond good methods for learning Chinese because, like I said in the introduction, there are many different ways that a method can be good. So here are three important ones. First, a method can be good by helping you focus on the right content, for instance, the right vocabulary, the right kind of grammar, and so on. So let's say that your goal is to converse with business partners in Chinese. Well, it then follows that a good method for learning Chinese is one that exposes you to this kind of language and allows you to acquire these types of structures and words in Chinese. A bad method would be something that focused on something completely different, let's say a standard textbook or a frequency list, which might contain lots of words that you are not interested in and that are kind of useless in the situation you want to use Chinese in. This also includes different areas of the language altogether, so since your goal was to converse with business partners, spending all your time writing characters by hand is not going to do much to help you reach your goals, and so this would be a bad method, at least according to this metric. So the second way a method can be good for learning Chinese is if it is efficient, meaning that using one method for an hour brings you closer to your goal than spending an hour using a different method. I discussed efficiency more in episode 124 if you want to check that out. Last but certainly not least, a method can be good because it is enjoyable and that enables you to spend much more time using the method than another method that isn't as interesting. This is extremely important because even if you study the right things, the right content, and you have a very efficient method, this doesn't matter at all if you then don't use this method enough to actually learn Chinese. Because a good method is a method that you are willing to use, and you have to use it a lot. In the short term, some people at least are able to force themselves to use a method they know is very efficient, even though they don't like it, but in the long term this can be very tricky and it has a serious downside when it comes to motivation. So the best method for learning Chinese would be one that optimizes all three of these things. So it's a method that enables you to focus on the right things. It's a super efficient method for learning those things, and you also find it very interesting, enabling you to spend a lot of time using this method. Unfortunately, for most of us, there is no such method. There is always a downside, and focusing on one of these factors will mean that you have to sacrifice one of the others, at least a little bit. To make this as concrete as possible, let's look at a few of these trade-offs. First, flashcards are efficient but not fun. Flashcards rely on two psychological effects that are extremely powerful for learning in general, and that's the spacing effect and active recall. And this makes flashcards really good for some things, and as I've argued elsewhere, and I'll put a link in the description, they are particularly suited for learning Chinese characters. But what if you hate flashcards? What are you supposed to do? Should you force yourself to use flashcards anyway? So this is one example of a trade-off, and these are the kinds of trade-offs that I want to talk about today. And I have a few more examples before we move on with how to deal with this kind of situation. So example number 2. Listening to Chinese learner podcasts with lots of English in them is inefficient, but it is more relaxing than Chinese-only alternatives. So if you find yourself in this situation, should you force yourself to listen to these more demanding podcasts because you know that's much better for your Chinese, even though this might lead to you spending less time listening? Third example. Talking with a familiar person, such as a friend or a familiar teacher, is much easier than talking to a stranger, but you won't learn as much. And this is especially true for listening ability, where it is important to diversify your listening to learn to deal with different kinds of Chinese, and this Chinese that different people speak, coming from different parts of China, different ages, different professions, social groups, and so on. So does that then mean that even though you've found a teacher you think is easy to talk to, that you should then switch teachers every month or so just to mix things up because that's, well, better for your Chinese? Or should you stay with your familiar teacher because it's easier and more fun? Reading about topics that genuinely interest you is great for motivation, but it's also forbiddingly difficult sometimes. Unless you are already at a very advanced level, most topics outside learner materials will be hard, and this means that you will be doing intensive reading rather than the extensive reading that I normally recommend. So given the choice between very hard but interesting texts or very boring but easy texts, which should you choose? So the fifth and final example is that leaving your comfort zone will help you learn more, but it is by definition uncomfortable. A good example of this might be throwing yourself into an immersion environment. And I've done this many times, and my listening ability has skyrocketed each time I've done this. But on the other hand, it is also extremely tiring, demanding, and sometimes frustrating to be in this environment. So does that mean that you should do it even though you don't enjoy it, or should you try to find a more pleasant way of learning? Naturally, I can't answer all these questions in this episode, and each of these situations can be rather complicated and also depends a lot on your specific situation, your level, and your resources for learning Chinese, and so on. But I can talk about this general situation. So what if a method that is otherwise very good is not just interesting, or even if you hate it, what should you do? Should you use it anyway and just suck it up, or should you try to do something else? And what might that be? One thing that I want to say is that having fun and enjoying learning Chinese is not just some kind of feel-good advice that I give out to people, it is dead serious. If you're going to learn Chinese, it's going to take years and you have to invest thousands of hours. And if you don't enjoy doing that, you probably won't get there. And even if you do get there, you will suffer a lot along the way. And probably you will also take longer to get there, because if you are using methods that you don't enjoy, you will find excuses and do other things. Whereas if you can find ways of learning Chinese that you truly enjoy, you will find it much easier to spend all that time and it won't feel like a chore anymore. However, this doesn't mean that you can have enjoyment or entertainment as the main goal, of course, because then we would have some really weird methods such as eating cookies or sleeping in on the weekend or watching cute kittens on YouTube, and these are all very enjoyable, but obviously they don't teach you any Chinese, and so they are bad methods. The point here is that enjoyment is very important, but it is not the only factor you use to evaluate if a method is good for you or not, and you have to take efficiency and studying the right things into account as well. This means different things for different students, but I'll get back to that in a bit. So what should you do if you learn about a method that you hear is very good? Maybe I've recommended it, maybe it's your teacher, maybe it's a student friend, or somebody else recommends you a method for learning Chinese that is supposedly really good. Well, the first thing you should do is to actually try it and give it a fair chance before you say anything else. So let's say somebody says flashcards are great for learning to write Chinese characters by hand. then actually take the time to try this method out. Don't just download one app and try it out for 2 days and say, I hate flashcards. Because there are so many different ways of doing flashcards, and you can use different apps, you can use different things on the flashcards, and there are so many things you can play around with, and maybe there is a method in there that you actually do like, and that allows you to reap the benefits of the flashcards, even though you thought you didn't like it at first. I recently listened to a teacher podcast where they talked about memory techniques and mnemonics, and this was very painful for me because they talked about how to memorize vocabulary and so on, and none of them had really tried this method at all, and they interviewed a memory champion, someone who was pretty good at using mnemonics for memorizing digits of pi or something else. And after the interview, they talked with each other, and they both kind of discarded the idea of mnemonics without ever having tried it. They thought all these things that I talk about here sometimes, about making up clever or weird or bizarre images for characters and so on, that was just too weird for them. That was not something for them. And they said, well, to each his own, well, this sounds too weird for me, I'm not going to do it. But if they had done it, I'm sure that they would have realized that they can also memorize lots of things very easily if they used the proper memory techniques, even though they looked very strange and not very interesting from the outside. And this is something I have talked about in the article Remembering is a Skill You Can Learn, and I've put a link to that in the description. So let's say that you have tried the method and you really don't like it. And the next step here is to think about how much do you dislike it and how efficient is the method. I don't mean to say that there is a simple equation describing if a method is good for you or not, but I do think that magnitude is important here. So if you hear about a method that is extremely good, or supposedly extremely good, but you don't like it, if you just have a slight aversion to it, or maybe you find it a little bit mediocre in the middle somewhere, well, maybe you can use it anyway because it's not so bad. But if you hate it with a passion and it destroys your learning experience in general, then obviously you need to do something about it. And the opposite is also true, of course. If a method is just slightly better than some other method, then what you think about it, how much you're willing to use it, becomes very important, much more important than the efficiency of the method itself. Another method to keep in mind is that you can use many different methods at once, of course, and you can use different methods for different areas or different tasks in your learning routine. So let's say that you find mnemonics a bit weird and you don't really enjoy using them, but you understand that in some cases they are actually very good and you've tried them out and you realize that they are good, but you just don't like it. Well, then don't use mnemonics for everything. Don't use it to memorize pronunciation of characters, and don't even use it for all characters. Just use it for those cases you find very hard to remember using your other methods, and you'll be fine. You don't have to use a method for everything in a certain category. This is often true even if you do like a method. So, for example, I like mnemonics and I like experimenting and exploring how memory works, but it's not like I create mnemonics for every single Chinese character I learn. I almost never create mnemonics for pronunciation of characters because I don't find that very difficult to remember, especially with phonetic components and so on. However, if I do run into a problem where I really need to remember, or say I forget the pronunciation of a character over and over again and I get tired of it, then I do create a mnemonic. But I don't do this all the time by default. The next step, after you try to limit the use of the methods you don't like, is to try to understand why the method works in order to see if you can reap the benefits of this method some other way. So earlier I used flashcards as an example, and I said that there are two principles that make flashcards work. One is spaced repetition, and the other is active recall. But do you know what these are and why they are useful? Because if you do, you will realize that there are other ways of getting the same benefits without using the flashcards. But if you just think of flashcards as an undivisible unit, a method you can use or not use, then you might miss these opportunities and think that flashcards is the only way. Active recall is when you actively search your long-term memory to try to come up with the answer, as opposed to seeing the right answer as a way of reviewing it. So for example, this would be the difference between reading a sentence as a way of reviewing the words in it, and reading a gap sentence and trying to recall what word goes in the gap. In the first case, you just see the characters, but in the second case, you have to actively pull that character that's supposed to be in the gap from your long-term memory, and this is much more efficient for strengthening that memory. And this is, of course, why simply rereading a book, for example, is a terrible way to prepare for an exam. The best example of this in Chinese is probably handwriting characters, because if you look at the characters while you write them, you don't process it deeply enough and you are not going to remember them. Whereas if you use something like flashcards or a prompt and you try to recall how to write a character from memory, it tends to stick much better. Spaced repetition is when you spread reviews out over time instead of massing them together. So if you're going to review a character, say 50 times, it's much better to spread it out with maybe a few hours in between to begin with, then the next day, the next week, next month, and so on. This is much more efficient than putting all these 50 reviews in one session, so you just write the character 50 times. That has actually almost no extra benefit beyond the first few reviews if you're after long-term retention. Okay, those were two sidetracks talking about active recall and spaced repetition, and I included this here because I wanted to show that it's important to understand why something works. When we talked about flashcards, and these are the two main reasons why flashcards are important. Another one might be that they are portable, you can have them on your phone wherever you are and things like that, but those are the two main reasons. So when it comes to spaced repetition, you can get that by simply using the language a lot or by being exposed to the language a lot. So if you read, and you have to read a lot here, you cannot just read your textbook or something like that. If you truly do extensive reading and you spend a lot of time doing that, you will see all the grammar patterns and characters and words over and over, and they will be naturally spaced out over time. Of course, I don't mean to say here that you should only use one method, so even if you're using flashcards, you should still do extensive reading. But I'm saying that if you really hate flashcards, then turn up the extensive reading a notch or two. So far, we've mostly talked about efficient methods that you might not like, such as flashcards, but we do also have the opposite case that I mentioned at the beginning, where you actually do like a method, but it's not very efficient. And I think a good example of this is listening to a podcast where the host speaks a lot of English and there is an occasional dialogue or something in Chinese. So as I've argued many times on the podcast, this doesn't really count as listening ability in Chinese. I mean, of course, the dialogue itself that is in Chinese counts, but the hosts talking about these things outside of the dialogue in English, explaining words and so on, does not count as listening practice. And in the worst cases, you might even listen for meaning in English and then not even pay that much attention. You don't really try to understand what they're saying in Chinese, and then maybe it counts as nothing at all. It basically has no benefit for you as a learner. However, some of these podcasts can be very enjoyable. Maybe you think the hosts are funny, or you like the stories they're talking about, and you would like them if they were in your native language too. And here we get back to eating cookies, sleeping in on the weekend, and so on. Why are you learning Chinese? If you're learning Chinese only because you think it's fun, then it does make sense to really choose the most fun method of learning, because if it isn't fun, you are not reaching your goal. But I think most people who listen to this podcast don't think like that, because then we would all be eating cookies instead of, learning Chinese characters. So this means we need to offset a decrease in efficiency with a commensurate increase in motivation. And exactly how this calculation turns out for you as an individual will be very, very different. So let's look at two extreme cases here. So if you have someone who is very strongly motivated to learn Chinese as quickly as possible and also kind of enjoy this type of learning, they should think twice about throwing out flashcards entirely, even if they don't like them, because it really is a very efficient method of learning certain things in Chinese. At the other end of the spectrum, we might have a high school student who maybe didn't choose to learn Chinese themselves. Maybe it was their parents who forced them to do it, or there wasn't another language to choose, or something like that. In this case, if you are the teacher, you need to be rather careful about which methods you choose, because if you choose something that the students are not willing to use and they don't like learning because of that, the result might be that they don't learn anything because they are not willing to even try. And so in this case, it doesn't matter at all that flashcards might be very efficient because the students are not willing to use them. And then you do have to put motivation and the willingness to use a method as the number one priority, and then after that you can consider what is efficient. Because as I've said before, an inefficient method that you use because you like it is much better than a very efficient method that you never use because you hate it. So I think that wraps up our discussion of good methods for learning Chinese, at least for this time. And if I were to summarize my advice here, it would be to explore, experiment, and enhance. So explore different methods, learn about them, maybe through continuing listening to my podcast or asking your teacher or your classmates. Then experiment, really try these methods out for yourself and see what you think. Do you like them? Do you hate them? Maybe somewhere in between. Are they efficient in helping you reach your goals? Then finally, use what you have learned, enhance your overall approach to learning Chinese, and gradually learn what method is best for you. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.